Do you remember that moment in Game of Thrones when Tywin Lannister admonishes Joffrey saying,
"Any man who must say, 'I am the king,' is no true king."
House of the Dragon, Episode 4, Season 2 is about that. Like most of Martin's writing, it is a critique of the institution of monarchy and its bloody consequences. I'm here in the north. I know it doesn't look cold, but this is the place that inspired the Starks. Winterfell. Today is a summery day and winter is always coming. Episode 4 features the battle for Rook's Rest, but I get that if you don't know the books, it might be a little confusing just where everyone and everything is. So I want to help you understand what the shape of the war looks like. Okay, so Team Green is at King's Landing here, the capital of the Seven Kingdoms, though Dorne isn't part of the Seven Kingdoms just yet. Team Black is on Dragonstone, this little island off to the east. The Velaryon fleet is currently blockading the Gullet, this stretch of water, preventing any trade by sea from reaching King's Landing, hence why people are starting to starve and riot. Now, the Velaryons, they're based on Driftmark, this little island right next to Dragonstone. The Hightowers, like Otto and Alicent, however, their family is based all the way down in the southwest at Oldtown. And right now, there's a Hightower army making their way up from the south. Somewhere in the north, the armies are gathering to march south to support Queen Rhaenyra. Daemon is at Harrenhal, a massive castle in the Riverlands here, and that battle between the Brackens and the Blackwoods last episode, it probably took place around about here. Now, Criston Cole set out with an army from King's Landing along the eastern coast, taking Castle Stokeworth, Rosby, taking Duskendale, a major port city, and finally now reaching Rook's Rest in this episode, instead of going to Harrenhal to challenge Daemon. See, Rook's Rest itself isn't actually strategically that important. It doesn't matter that much. But Criston Cole wanted to lure some of the Black's dragons into a trap, which he did with Meleys and Rhaenys. But it's in this episode we find a major change from the books. Now again, Fire and Blood is written like a historical book. It's full of biases and contradictions. It is not like a strict canon. But in the history, it tells it as Aegon and Aemond working together to ambush Rhaenys, and it works. Whereas here, Aegon was never meant to show up to battle in the first place. And it's no wonder the history books paint it this way. This is how Aegon would want it to be remembered, as kind of like a victorious sacrifice in which they took down an incredibly powerful dragon rider. That's how he would want to be remembered. And one of the major conflicts in this episode, and the series more broadly, is over Aegon's inadequacy. At the small council meeting, others talk over and around Aegon, and he learns Criston Cole and Aemond have been communicating without his knowledge, waging their little war. Aemond has always been a better warrior, a wiser leader. As he said himself, "'Tis I, the younger brother, who studies history and philosophy. It is I who trains with the sword, who rides the largest dragon in the world. It is I who should be king." Right? And now Aemond is leading the fight without Aegon. Aegon complains to Alicent that they need to listen to him. Why? Because he's the king. And she basically says what Tywin does. You know, do you think putting that crown on your head makes you suddenly wise? No, I hoped you would be better than this by now.
You really think a crown gives you power?
Not that Alicent ever really gave Aegon an opportunity to learn, to become that. People refer to Criston Cole as the Kingmaker, and last episode Otto told Aegon to his face, "I put you on the throne." Over and over, Aegon is told that he is in his position, he is who he is, not through anything he did, not through any of his own virtue. It's all being attributed to others. And he hates that. And so when Alicent tells him, the best thing you can do right now, you dumb little child, is nothing, he takes that personally. Worst of all, Aemond humiliates him at the small council meeting by speaking fluently in High Valyrian to him, while Aegon can barely string a sentence together, as if Aemond is the true heir to their Valyrian heritage. Halfway through the episode, we watch Aegon slowly push a flag into the edge and then letting it fall and shatter. This is him, it's his ego, and he gets on Sunfire, dons Aegon's Valyrian steel armor in hopes of feeling better about himself, and flies off to war. And of course, the first moment he shows up to battle, he is torn to shreds. Rhaenys rips him limb from limb. He was never going to win this. Rhaenys is trained. Aegon has barely ever faced battle. He is now suffering the consequences of, yes, his own mistakes, but his own ego, his inadequacy. But the more important beat here is what Aemond does, because in the books, Aemond and Aegon, they're working together, as I said. But here, Aemond sees an opportunity to rid himself of his dumb, non-philosopher king brother. He deliberately lets Vhagar loose, showering them all in flame, knowing full well it will probably kill him, and then, once he's fallen out of the sky, he goes and finds his brother's body and draws out his sword, fully willing to end him just to make sure when Criston Cole comes across him, making sure he can't. He was fully willing to betray his brother to get him out of the picture, or put him in a position of even more power. But what is interesting is that I went back to the book, Fire and Blood, and you can definitely see how this story is kind of like how it would have played out that way. This is a tiny minor spoiler for like the very start of the next episode, so if you don't want that, skip to this timestamp, but I'm just going to read a little passage. "You must rule the realm now until your brother is strong enough to take the crown again," the king's hand told Prince Aemond. "Nor did Sir Criston need to say it twice," writes Eustace. "And so one-eyed Aemond, the kinslayer, took up the iron and ruby crown of Aegon the Conqueror. It looks better on me than it ever did on him," he says. It's interesting how we can sort of get those hints of Aemond and Criston working, conspiring against Aegon. Now, it's not that Criston was in on Aemond kind of trying to bring Aegon down in this way, but you can see how he's sort of leaning into it. In the books, we're told that the fire burnt so hot that it melded Aegon's armor into his flesh. And we'll have to see how that pans out in the future episodes. Another foundational idea in House of the Dragon is dragons as animals. They've done a fantastic job bringing these creatures to life, blending them with reality. I was genuinely tearing up when Meleys and Rhaenys were flying, they're falling, and she looks back at her and she's like, "I'm sorry," and Rhaenys has this bond with her. It was really well done. Knowing they're about to die, the ominous silent glide of Vhagar for something so vast and powerful, that was a fantastic choice. And it's also great how every moment on screen you can see how these characters are sort of deluding themselves into thinking they can fully control these dragons. Because dragons are nuclear weapons, right? They make this conflict unlike anything we've seen before. They can turn the tide of any battle, but they are also animals capable of pain and sadness and love with their riders. They make our characters far more dangerous than they would be on their own, the consequences of their actions far larger and bloodier. Yes, for themselves, but more importantly for the small folk. And keep that in mind because that's going to become very relevant very much later. And I reckon if you went back and you looked at the series with knowledge of what's going to happen in the future, you will see how they're building towards certain events. But I also loved how in this episode they never forgot that even at the height and the coolness of a Dragon Rider battle, this show, the Dance of the Dragons, this history is a tragedy. You know, Rhaenys goes to save Rook's Rest, but as she falls out of the sky, she crashes into the castle, breaching the walls and allowing the oncoming army to take it. Aegon flies out to prove himself, but he falls too, sacrificing much of his army. And over what? Rook's Rest isn't even strategically important. In the Dance of Dragons, nobody wins, but everyone bleeds. At the end of the episode, Criston Cole stumbles through a wasteland battlefield. He touches a suit of armor meant to protect you from everything it can, but whoever it was has been entirely turned to ash. Criston, keep in mind, he's one of those soldiers who have never really seen war on this scale. He grew up on the stories of its glory. He imagined that violence as an important part of himself, and now it's turning to ash in his hands. War is this beautiful but hollow suit of armor kneeling on a battlefield. Dragons are animals of mass destruction. But in trying to understand how this war is panning out, with two dragons kind of down, I think it's worth trying to understand how many dragons each side has. Because you might not necessarily kind of intuitively know. Now, there are a bunch of baby dragons, dragon eggs, which are basically useless. It's a little bit different in the books. Some dragons are like older or younger or can't be used. And so we're only going to be counting kind of the adult dragons, which they can use to fight. Team Green have Vhagar and Tessarion, but Tessarion is all the way down in Old Town with Daemon Targaryen. He hasn't showed it up yet. They do technically have Dreamfire, who is Helena's dragon, but she isn't in much of a shape to fight, you think, right? Team Black, though, they have Syrax, Caraxes, Vermax, and Moondancer. Now, only Vhagar and Caraxes are battle-hardened, and so wherever they are not, both sides are more vulnerable, but it's worth noting that there are unclaimed dragons. There's Vermithor, Silverwing, Sea Smoke, Cannibal, and a bunch of others. Who knows what might happen to them? New dragon riders can turn the tides of war. And Vhagar is easily the most powerful dragon in Westeros. Caraxes might be kind of younger, leaner, faster, but Vhagar has seen hundreds of years of fighting. She is unlikely to be hurt by fire or a scorpion bolt. Something incredibly powerful would be needed to take her out. Now, meanwhile, Daemon is on his spiritual field trip of enlightenment over at Harrenhal. If only Zuko was there with him. Now, the episode opens with Daemon meeting a young Rhaenyra again, who tells him, "You created me, yet now you are intent on destroying me," before he cuts off her head. How nice. He sees his second wife, Laena Velaryon, who maybe he feels a bit guilty over what happened to her, but he also sees a vision of himself as Aemond Targaryen, and the parallels between these two characters are intensifying, especially in this episode. Both of them see themselves as the true heir to the throne, but more importantly, as the spiritual successor to their Valyrian Targaryen heritage. I want to remind you that in Season 1, Daemon also spoke in High Valyrian to Rhaenyra fluently, as a way of proving himself as superior, as a true son of Valyria. Both of them see their monarchs as weak in some way, and in this episode, both are kind of betraying them for personal gain. Now, he finally meets the person kind of doing all of this to him in the flesh. This is Alice Rivers, a really interesting character who they're kind of leaning into as this old magic witch person. She seems to be able to read minds or something of some kind. She knows that Daemon is quarreling with Rhaenyra. She knows that he wants the throne for himself. But what is interesting is none of this is really recorded in the books. In fact, in the books we're told whatever her powers, it would seem Daemon Targaryen was immune to them, for little is heard of this supposed sorcerer whilst the prince held Harrenhal. I suspect this is the kind of history which would not have been recorded. Daemon doesn't like to feel weak, and he probably wouldn't tell people about this happening to him if it did. But for me, that's really interesting because there's so much stuff they could do with Daemon that isn't covered in the books, and I don't entirely know where it's going. If I was to hazard a guess, I reckon they're going to undergo this kind of reflection arc where Daemon is going to kind of think about, like, why is he fighting? What does he really want? Is what he's doing justified? And what should he be fighting for? Alicent is the other character at the heart of this episode. See, last episode, she learned that her whole reason for thinking Aegon should be on the throne was a lie. It was a misunderstanding. And now she's struggling to internalize that. What do you do when you realize everything that's been motivating you is kind of a lie? She does say the significance of Viserys' intentions died with him. This idea that the conflict isn't really over that anymore, it's over blood and revenge and the personal ambitions and desires of the characters at hand, like Aegon's inadequacy driving him to war. But she is facing choices now, and we don't really know where it's going to go with her. The history books are not kind to Alicent in ways which are obviously biased, but I really like what they've done with her character so far, and I don't know where they're going to take her next. How does she live with herself? Now, someone pointed out something interesting about last episode. I cannot take credit for this, but Helena said to her at one point, "I forgive you." Now, this might be forgiveness for forcing Helena into the spotlight, for playing her part in all of this violence, but Helena is a dreamer. She can see parts of the future. We've seen that a few times in the series. And what if she is forgiving Alicent for something she has not yet done? Does she betray the Greens? Does she help Rhaenyra in some way? Does she play some role in someone's downfall? We don't know. Now, it's still true that Alicent's children are still a threat to Rhaenyra's throne if she was to ever get it. It is hard to imagine a world in which the Greens and Blacks' children can both coexist, but we've also seen that the signs are not as clear-cut as they are in the history books. Aemond and Daemon are fighting for themselves, almost betraying their own causes. Criston and Larys arguably fight more for Alicent than themselves. Would Larys really remain loyal to the Greens without her? What will Corlys do now his wife has been sacrificed to the cause and so many of his children are taken out of it? I've been critical of a few of the changes the show has made to kind of the story as it's presented in the books, but the ones that we've seen in this episode, I am fully behind, and I really like them. And I do actually like most of the changes in the series so far. There's only been a couple which I was kind of like, I don't know. But the dance continues, and we can only pray that more people aren't caught beneath their feet. But tell me down below, what did you think of this episode? My wife turned to me at the end of this and she said this was probably the best episode in the series so far, which I can totally agree. I think it's got some amazing pieces moving inside of it. Which parts did you like? Which parts were you kind of surprised by? If you haven't read the books, do tell me what you thought about kind of this happening. I'd be very interested in your thoughts there. Stay nerdy. Grab my books, which are about fantasy and sci-fi. I'm a published writer, all that sort of stuff. There's my own writing and word building books, which if you're interested in learning how to write and word build, you can pick those up as well. Links down below. Stay nerdy, and I will see you in the future.